After seeing that, anyone want more, baby? Okay. So today, we'll continue our study through the Exodus, and we come to chapter 17. And throughout our study in the book of Exodus, we learned that God brought the Israelites are God's people, out of Egypt and led them with His presence, His power, and His provision. And we've been singing about that. We've been talking about that over and over. And last week, we saw how God provided daily bread in the morning, meat in the evening to the Israelites. And these people, they certainly didn't deserve such grace, because they kept on complaining to God, doubting God's love for them. However, God continued to show His grace and love, and He will continue to do that for days to come, like a loving mother. Actually, today, as I was meditating upon chapter 17, everything that we'll talk about today reminded me of motherly love. The things that Moses does, the things that he says, the things that he stands for, what God does. God's love is depicted in this passage. And we can, on this day, think about our motherly love. All the love that we have received from our mothers and mother figures in our lives. By the way, if today brings a painful reminder of your mother's passing, I pray for God's comfort for you, especially those of you who lost your moms in recent days and months and years. Know that God cares for you and that God loves you. And God will continue to place many motherly figures in your life so that you'll continue to feel sense of the presence of your mom in your life. With that, Hosea chapter 11, verses 1 through 4, I think is a beautiful description of our relationship with God and the motherly love that we talked about. It says this: when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals and they burned incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms, but they did not realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. To them, I was like the one who lifts a little child to the cheek, and I bent down to feed them. What a motherly love. I know oftentimes we refer to God as our Father, but today you will see the motherly love of God displayed in the lives of the Israelites. And in that same passage in Hosea chapter 11, God goes on to say that He will never give up on them. That He says, my heart is going after you and I cannot stop loving you because you're my children. And I hope and pray that you would always remember that. And that you will tell that to your children. Just like you love your children, just like David and Michelle look at Judah and just cannot stop kissing and loving him. God loves us the same way, despite the fact the Israelites certainly didn't deserve it. So today, as we dive into chapter 17 of Exodus, you might be thinking, wait, didn't we just read this? Because you'll find out they're just going through the same cycle of grumbling, getting in trouble, doubting God. So with that, let's just jump right in to chapter 17. I'll just read a couple verses here to get us started. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, what am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me. Once again, it sounds like we're just reading the same thing again and again. And let me just give you a heads up. It's going to be like that. throughout their journey in the wilderness. Grumbling after grumbling. Just like our lives, right? And some of your parents here, that sounds like my kids. You're definitely right. But in this case, if you think about the reason why they're grumbling, it is actually kind of understandable to have concerns over their real needs. They're thirsty. Water is an essential thing that you need. So in a sense, it makes sense that they are complaining about not having water, being thirsty. Not only that, they are in the desert. So water is an essential need of theirs. However, what is not okay is their response in terms of anger, panic, and bitterness. Ultimately, unbelief. Instead of talking to God in honest lament and prayer, asking Lord, God, you provided us with bread and meat. Could you provide us with water? Instead of doing that, they quarreled. They argued with Moses and tested the Lord, as the passage says. Saying in verse 7 says, is God among us? That was the root of their question and complaint. Is God really with us? Does God really love us? Does God even care about us? Doesn't He see the suffering that's happening in my life? Isn't that our question even today? The same question that we ask again and again. They tested the Lord by saying, is God among us? But come on, where was their faith? How can they question God's presence when He, even this day, they woke up and they saw the manna on the ground? Every single day we learned last week, until they entered the promised land, God continued to give them the daily bread. And I told you last week, God's presence and His glory was revealed through His provision. Every time they were fed the bread in the morning, God says, I'll reveal my glory. Every time you eat that meat, you will know that it was I who rescued you and led you out of Egypt. How can they, after experiencing all that every single day, still ask this question, is God among us? How much more does God have to prove Himself in His presence? Again, it's like a deja vu. And it's like us, our lives. We see ourselves in this. I see myself in this. But when we think about what they're doing in this instance, it was actually more than just complaining. Just the fact that Moses comes to God and says, they're ready to stone me, I believe it was more than just a complaint. The idea of quarreling here goes far beyond just grumbling. The term used here is like a legal accusation and condemnation against Moses. They're basically saying you're guilty of a crime and therefore you deserve to be stoned. That's how serious their complaining was. It wasn't like, I'm thirsty, give me some water. No, they were ready to pick up the stone and kill Moses because you promised us that God will lead us. But we're thirsty. Therefore, you're guilty as charged. You're committing a crime against us because you are not delivering on your promise. That's how serious the situation was. They really needed God's divine intervention. When we read Moses cried out, we might just think, oh, he just came to the Lord. He prayed to the Lord. No, I really believe Moses cried out to the Lord because he was so overwhelmed. He might have felt that his life was in danger. Just put yourself in that situation. Everybody is ready to stone you, complaining to you. He's literally crying out to the Lord in fear and anxiety, with stress. What am I to do with these people? That's what he said. What am I to do with these people? Can you sense the desperation of Moses? Have you been in that place, perhaps as parents? God, what am I going to do with my children? Of course, they're not going to pick up stones and kill you. But how often we come to this place of being overwhelmed? But the question is, what are you going to do when you're in that situation? Are you going to continue to try to find a way to provide a solution based on your experience and your knowledge? Look up how to do parenting, how to be a good father, a good mother? Or are you going to run to the Lord? Cry out to the Lord. Because if Moses did anything right, there's one thing that he did well. Depending on the Lord. The best trait of Moses was that he always brought difficulties to the Lord. And that's what he does in this instant as well. Because Moses knew that he did not have an answer. That he could not provide what they're asking for. But he knew that he could always turn to the Lord for guidance, strength, and provision. Just imagine how many times Moses had to do this for the next 40 years. It wasn't just this one time. 40 years in the wilderness, leading such, as Bible calls them, stiff-necked people. We think parenting is difficult. You can find comfort in the story of Moses today. In crying out to the Lord, we not only see dependence on the Lord, but we see leadership of Moses. Moses took ownership of his role as a leader and a shepherd and took the matters of the people to the Lord. He sincerely wanted to solve their issues for them. Time and again, we see Moses interceding on behalf of the people. When they're hungry, when they sin, there are many instances Moses steps in. God's about to strike them, but Moses steps in and asks for God's mercy. God, forgive them. And I think that's leadership, taking ownership of his role, even though people are ready to stone him. What a great leader he was. He did not just care for himself. He was not worried about saving his face, seeking his own good. But as he's crying out for God's comfort, he's asking the Lord for solution. Why? Not just for him, but for the people that he was called to serve. A good leader, people, please get this right. A good leader is not someone who may appear confident and competent, but someone who truly cares for the people he's called to lead and serve. A good leader doesn't leave people behind or tell people to get out of his or her way to accomplish his or her egocentric goals, but cares deeply for their needs and wants to do everything in his power to serve them and to meet their need. Instead of calling it quits and running away from the problem, as a good shepherd, we see Moses brought the issue to the Lord, wanting to do something about it. Do you see why I saw mothers in this passage? Because I see a mom in this, and dads too, or more moms. So what does God do? What does God do? As Moses is crying out, this is what God does. God encourages Moses and God empowers him. We see many different ways that God solves the problems of God's people. As we saw from the beginning chapters of Exodus, we know God, many times, He Himself comes to the rescue. That He will send the quail, that He Himself will provide for the people. But in this case, God does it a little differently, which helps us to know that God doesn't always work the same way. The way that God works in my life may look a little bit different in your life. And I love that about God. God is so creative. God has full of surprises. And He does that this time. God, instead of just providing water for the Israelites, He knew what He had to do. Not only to provide the needs of the Israelites, He knew that He had to encourage and empower Moses. Chapter 17, verses 5 to 6, this is what it says. Go out in front of the people, talking to Moses. Take with you some of the elders of Israel and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will stand there before you and by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. God's intervention came through Moses. Just think about all this. Because in God's hand, God's eyes, God's perspective, He had to tackle two different things. Not only to tackle the problem or the need of the people, but He cared about Moses. So He goes on to encourage Moses to overcome the current problem that he was facing. He empowered him by reminding him of the power and authority God placed in his hands. He says, look at the staff. Pick it up. Think about what they represent. My choice, my power, and my authority that I put in that staff. The staff was a symbol of God's power and authority. And as he lifted up that staff, I'm sure he thought about all the miracles that God brought about through the staff. Not only that, listen to what God says to him. I will stand there before you by the rock. Oftentimes, that's all we need, right? I remember saying the same thing to my kids when they were in fear. I'm sure most parents do the same thing. Whether it was getting a shot at the doctor's office, my kids don't do that anymore, I promise you. They get a little scared about getting shots, but I remember one time Ryan was so scared. I clearly remember that one incident. We were at Dr. Choi's office. Anyone go to Dr. Choi? I feel like every person goes to Dr. Choi. He's a pediatrician in Rockville. But anyway, I remember clearly in the office, he was about to give him a shot. And then Ryan's like, hold, wait, I'm not ready. And he was like, I love that about doctors. I'm sure he sees so many crying kids. They don't care. They're like, I remember I had to hold him down. I had to tell him, bribe him. I'll buy you ice cream. And, ultimately, I had to comfort him. And not only that, when our children try new things for the first time, like riding the bicycle, oftentimes I'd be like, yeah, daddy's right there. I'll hold you. But I'm lying. I'm like, are you there? Yeah. But God doesn't do that, obviously. I did that. And when your children go into a dark place for whatever reason, they're so scared because of all these monsters they think about. Going down the slide, I remember taking my kids to the playground. It looks so big and amazing, but they're so scared to go up there, so I have to go up there with them and then go down the slide with them. Every time. And then when they were getting a little older and I told them to go to sleep on their own, I remember they were like, no, you sleep here with me. I'm like, oh my gosh. I remember so many times, so many nights, I would just lie there, trying to see if they're asleep so I can leave. Remember those nights? Maybe some of your parents are going through that right now. All that to say, to our children, the only assurance they needed was that I was with them, that I'm there for them. Whether that's being in the same room with them or being downstairs when they ask, Daddy, are you there? And yeah, I'm here. I would often repeat, Daddy's here. Daddy's here. You'll be okay. Don't worry. My presence made all the difference for them. in tackling the biggest challenges of their lives. In the same way, God is doing the same thing for you. To you, it may seem like the massive slide that is so hard to go down, that you never tried before, but God says, don't worry, my son, my daughter, I'll protect you. I'll be with you. Take courage. And that's what God does with Moses. He stands with him. He doesn't say, go, do what I told you, and come back and report to me. No. In his encouragement, he says, I'll be right there with you and by you. And I love the fact that God doesn't stop there. He not only encourages him, but he empowers him in the sight of all the people. And he says, go, Moses, be the leader that I called you to be. I empowered you. I gave you the tools. So go, be the leader that you're called to be. Go strike the rock and do it in front of all the people so they may see that I work through you. Moses didn't have to stand before people to prove anything or say anything. All he had to do was to lift the staff that God has given him. And he struck the rock. And everybody knew that Moses had the authority of God and the power of God working through him. That day, every single Israelite witnessed the power of God working through Moses. Just like at the Red Sea, when he lifted the staff and water gushed out on that day from the rock. The whole entire Israelites, they drank from it. What a lesson for the Israelites. It's almost like, oh yeah, you're going to stone my servant? Let me show you that he's actually working for me and I need him. In the second half of chapter 17, another battle comes along. If wandering around the desert and dealing with all the challenges wasn't enough, and they just went through this crazy back and forth about having water. But now, as we jump into verse 8, they are now faced with a war they were not prepared for. It's almost like when it rains, it pours, doesn't it? Maybe Moses was like, that was tough, but I'm glad it's over. And as he turns around, he sees the warriors of Amalek just coming and attacking his people. It's like today. We feel like things are just piling on and on and on. And we feel so unprepared, confused, scared, restless, and hopeless. And I think the Israelites were in the same boat. But keep this big picture in mind. Big picture in mind. When going through these moments in our lives, we need to know that God is there with us. Take a step back. Because we have the comfort of reading the story and seeing the big picture. And you're like, oh, why are they panicking? God is there with them. What if you just take a step back and look into your life and be able to say, you know what? Why am I panicking? Why am I so hopeless? Remind ourselves that God is there with us every step of the way. How do you know that? Because in verse 1, I don't know if you caught that. There's a phrase says, as the Lord commanded. They traveled as the Lord commanded. God was the one guiding them through the wilderness. It wasn't an accident they found themselves in this place. And God led them there. God brought them there. So they are attacked by the Amalekites. In New Living Translation says they're the warriors of Amalek. And if you remember in chapter 13 of Exodus, the way that God led them thus far, He actually helped them to avoid war because He knew that they will actually scare them to death and will make them want to go back. This is what it says in verse 17 and 18 in chapter 13 of Exodus. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was a shorter path. For God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led people around by the desert road towards the Red Sea. You see the wisdom of God? Providence of God? God knew His people, that they weren't ready to face any war. For whatever reason, they are at war right now. This was the very first war they faced. So the question is, are they ready to fight? Are they ready to fight the warriors of more experienced, well-trained soldiers and fighting in their territory? Remember, the Israelites were just wanderers in the desert. What do they know about battles? Even the weapons they might have is probably not as good. And think about this. This was a massive group traveling together in family units. When was the last time you took a family trip with little kids? Can you move fast? No. Do kids complain more? Yeah, they're thirsty and hungry. Think about engaging a battle with your enemy, with little children, older parents, millions of people. I believe the Israelites were a vulnerable target to the enemies. At least it would appear so to them. It would appear their odds were against God's people for sure. And that the Amalekites certainly had an advantage over Israelites to win this battle. Well, at least on the surface, it may look like that. But we know what happens. We think the Amalekites had the advantage, but in verse 11, in New Living Translation says this: as long as Moses held up the staff in his hand, the Israelites had the advantage. I really hope and pray that we get this. It may seem like to you, the current situation that you're in, that the enemy is winning. That he's having a feast over your life, that you feel so defeated, that nothing is working out in your life. But God says, nuh-uh. Not in my watch. Not under my watch. I got you. Trust me. In this situation, if Moses is like you and I, we will use human logic. And the smart thing to do would be what? To find a way to escape. Somehow avoid the war instead of fighting them straight on. But Moses did not do that. We find out, instead of running away, Moses, after he was encouraged and empowered by God, perhaps something clicked in his mind, he actually exercised leadership and wisdom to come up with a battle strategy. And what I find very interesting is that there's no record of having a conversation between Moses and God about this. Perhaps there was. But I believe this battle strategy was something that Moses came up with after he was empowered by God. Of course, God approved of it. Moses turns around to Joshua and he says this: choose some of our men, verse 9, and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow, I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. You might be like, what? You're telling me to go fight? And then you're going to go up to the hill? What are you saying? I believe Moses had confidence that God would bless this battle plan. Moses believed that God would once again deliver them from the Amalekites, just like God delivered them when they were faced with the Red Sea ahead of them and the Egyptian soldiers attacking them from behind. The funny thing is, when we know and have assurance that God is with us, we can attempt some crazy things. The reason why we cannot attempt big things for God is because We just simply don't trust the Lord. Think about all the giants of faith in the Bible. It's not that they had special skills or talent. It was their faith in the Lord that God was with them. So Joshua fought as Moses ordered, verse 10 says. Just think about that for a little bit. I mean, if you're Joshua, you want to obey Moses, especially after you witnessed how God provided the water through him. But as he's going around to pick soldiers who can go fight, imagine how discouraged he would have been. Oh, that guy? Oh yeah, you can walk? Okay, you come join me. You can breathe? Okay. Anyone who can breathe and hold a weapon, just come join me. We're going to fight this battle together. Fighting in a war with people who never engaged in a battle. These are people who lived their whole lives as slaves. The only thing they were good at was complaining, but skill they had was to make bricks. What are you going to do? Make bricks and throw it at the enemies? All that to say, these people weren't ready. But for whatever reason, Joshua saw the confidence in Moses and he trusted Moses and he simply obeyed and put his life on the line by going out to the battlefield with a whole bunch of soldiers. And then in verse 10, latter half of 10 and 11, we find out Moses, as he said, he went up to the hill, nearby hill. And it says this, as long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. And let me wrap up with this. Don't you ever question, why did God go through all this? Why couldn't God do the same thing? Maybe make the water just gush out and create some kind of river to block out the Amalekites from coming and attacking God's people. Why did God choose to do it this way? Why did God make Joshua go fight the battle and Moses go up the hill and pray and hold his hand up? And then when it goes down, God's people are losing. Why did God allow all these things happen instead of just wiping out the Amalekites for the Israelites? I believe God wanted to teach them that they need to persevere through trials instead of finding easy ways out. Oftentimes we refer to verses like Corinthians, right? When face temptations, God will give you a way out. That's actually a wrong application of that verse. Yes, God will give you a way out, but the verse actually says that God will help you to persevere, give you strength to endure through temptations and trials. We need to stop looking for an exit ramp and see what the Lord is doing and engage in the battle in faith, knowing that God will strengthen you and I and protect you and fight for us. While Joshua was fighting the battle with his weapon, Moses fought the battle in prayer. This is why I really, really appreciate our intercessors. People who pray on behalf of me, for the church, people who take the requests from the people to the Lord. Moses lifted his hands up. Raising of hands was how the Hebrew people prayed. It's almost like us closing our eyes and bowing our heads. This describes a posture of dependence on the Lord and prayer. And the beautiful picture is not that he only prayed, but when his hands grew tired. So if we had time, I was going to ask someone to come up and just keep your hands up. I used to do that when I was in Korea growing up. There was a punishment. Whenever I got in trouble, which was every day I got in trouble, my teacher would be like, okay, you know what to do. I go out there. And then you stand like that for the entire class, and then slowly the hands come down, and the teachers hit you, and they're like, oh. Of course, here, Moses is not being punished by God, But imagine how difficult it would have been for Moses to hold up his hands. And he was seeing the battle happening in front of his eyes. As soon as the hand came down, the Israelites were losing. And then he lifts his hand up. He sees the Israelites winning. Everyone was able to see that. So this happened. When Moses' hands grew tired, they, meaning Aaron and Hur, they took a stone and put it under him so he can sit down. He sat on it, and Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on each side, so that his hands remained steady until sunset. I'll have the worship team come up. Brothers and sisters, I know all of you can pray on your own. I know that God hears your prayers. But one thing I know for sure is that you will grow weary. Many times. Please depend on one another. Please share your prayer requests with other people. Because doesn't matter how strong you are, doesn't matter how faithful you are, your hands will grow tired. And you need people to hold your hands up. You need a community to keep you steady, holding up your hands together. What a beautiful picture of a community relying upon one another. It didn't matter how strong Moses was. Yes, he was the leader, but he could not do what he did without the help of Aaron and Hur by his side. What a beautiful picture. Joshua fighting the battle on the battleground. Moses fighting his battle upon the hill through prayer. And Aaron and Hur just holding up Moses' hand. Beautiful teamwork. And last thing that I want to share before we go into time of response is after all this, obviously they experience victory. They're able to battle and win. And you know what Moses does? Verse 15 says, Moses built an altar. Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." I think this is very significant because a lot of times we tend to put up our own banner and said, "I did it. It was my knowledge, it was my skill, it was my fighting skills, it was my money." By declaring that the Lord is my banner, he's acknowledging that he's under the leadership of Yahweh, God. That God is over my house. Mothers and fathers, what kind of banner is hanging over your household today? Whatever accomplishments that you make, whatever success that you have, whose banner is hanging over you? When your children see everything that you do, how you provide for the family, who do they think and see as a source of everything? The Lord is the banner over our church. Not me, not other pastors, not elders. The Lord has to be the banner of our house, our church. That's why Moses built an altar and recognized God's faithfulness as his power over what had just taken place. Whether it was water or war, God provided. Therefore, he built an altar to the Lord and made sure he recognized it and declared it. Let's all stand. Today we're going to sing this song. This is a really old song by Hillsong. In the lyrics, it talks about standing in his presence, singing an anthem. The image that I thought about was the Olympics. You all love to watch the Olympics, whether it's opening ceremony or the closing ceremony. What do? People walk in with what? Flags. It shows them who they belong to. And they hold that flag with so much pride and joy. It doesn't matter whether a small country somewhere in the corner of Africa, whether it's US, doesn't matter. You see their face, whether it's just one person, one athlete, versus like hundreds of athletes, one common thing that you see during those ceremonies is that they hold it up with so much pride and joy. So the question today, as we sing this song and respond to the message today, what about you? Whose banner are you gonna hold up? For yourself? For your family? And whose banner are we holding up as a church? And are we gonna do that with shame? I hope people don't recognize me, that I belong to God. What if we start to be more proud of who we are as children of God, people who belong to the kingdom of God, and hold a banner over high with confidence? It says, look at me, I belong to this God, this God. So as we sing the song, let's have that image in our minds and declare that we belong to Him. Let's sing together.